So I really need to get my bangs trimmed. It is that time. I need to go and see my hairdresser. So for those who are not Canadian, a toque is a knitted hat. Welcome to How I Spin. This month is a special bonus edition of How I Spin. I am chatting about the final part of my Charollais exploration. We will talk about how this old skein was stashed after spinning and finishing, a project that sparked inspiration, and how certain projects lend themselves to handspun yarn. In this vlog this month, you will feel empowered to try knitting with your handspun that you've stashed for a long while, and I hope you get it out, admire your workmanship, and at least knit a swatch with a couple of different needle sizes to see what fabrics you can make. If you've found that this offers you value and enjoy your time spent here, I would love it if you would think about heading over to patreon.com/wellforpearls and joining our community. A small monthly subscription of just $1 per month gives you access to the audio podcast Woolen Spinning Radio, and a bit more means you can join our very chatty, welcoming, and inspiring community of hand spinners who are as passionate about making yarn as you are. I am able to keep the podcast ad-free because of a small group of dedicated viewers who support the show month to month, and we would love to get to know you. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy this month's bonus vlog. In our study of Charollais, I decided to do some stash diving and look at a yarn I had spun for the Crafty Jack's boutique, Katrina's Fiber Club, in May of 2019. My hope for this How I Spin supplement is to give those who have not subscribed to The Thoughtful Spinner or How I Spin in the past a taste of what this content is like and what we focus on. I hope you enjoy this extra How I Spin vlog and PDF download this month. Linked down below is the Patreon post associated with this video. Attached to the post is a downloadable PDF of the transcript for this video with photos to further describe my process for this project. If you are interested in subscribing to this content and receiving it monthly, please check out the links in the post. All right, let's delve in. Breed and color study is an opportunity for us to spend some time looking at a specific breed or fiber type while simultaneously exploring color and color management. This time round, we looked at a carded preparation and the sheep breed Charollais. I had a skein of Charollais in my stash that I had spun as singles for Katrina's Fiber Club, as I mentioned. I decided to pull it out and spend some time thinking about what I could create with this gradient skein of yarn that had been on my mind since spinning it over a year ago. Let's talk about my project planning process. We will then talk about the patterns I looked at on Ravelry and what I was looking for, and finally we will discuss the finished object and some learning. Normally in How I Spin, part of my process is to explain how I spun the yarn, including some video and reflections. But because I spun this yarn so long ago, I don't have any video of it. I have linked the blog post I wrote about this yarn in the Patreon post, and to my recollection, I spun the bat by stripping it down into nests following the gradient. The springy, down like wool spun long backwards draw into woolen singles. And I remember the spinning experience being absolutely lovely. To finish the yarn, I fulled the Charollais by submerging it in sinks of hot water and ice cold water until I thought it was satisfactorily fulled. I snapped and thwacked the yarn to bring out the airy poof factor and hung it to dry. Then into this stash, this gorgeous singles yarn went. Yarn that is thrown into my handspun stash seems to end up being left in there, unfortunately. This is something I am constantly working on, as I love working on slightly smaller projects and feeling the enjoyment of getting things done. I have actively looked for a while now for smaller projects and those that lend themselves to handspun yarn. We covered yarn substitution in the spring of 2020, all of which is linked in the Patreon post. And I often look at patterns with the intention to spin yarns that would work within that pattern. More often though, I have already spun the yarn and I am looking to put yarns into a pattern that was already written and published. This was the case here. I had the yarn, but what to do with it? After polling our virtual spin group, who are incredibly helpful, I decided to take the fulled Charollais singles and chain ply the yarn. This meant that I didn't have quite so much yardage to cope with, and I would be able to knit up a small project, maybe a toque or mitts, that would highlight the gradient aspect of the yarn. When we look at yarns we want to incorporate into projects, one of the things we often lament in projects that go sideways is that the colors don't quite work out the way we had intentioned. Here is an example where I could have done a number of things with the yarn. I knew I didn't want to leave it as the lace weight singles because to knit it up would have taken an eternity. Not really, but you get the gist. And I wanted to preserve the gradient. Identifying two goals, thicken up the yarn and preserve the gradient, gave me a starting point. The question became whether to ply it with another singles to create a barber pulled 2-ply, chain ply the yarn to create a thicker worsted weight 3-ply yarn, or think completely outside the box and maybe ply from a center pull ball and throw out the gradient by creating a barber pulled yarn that was folded back on itself. To meet two of my goals, thickening up the yarn and preserving the gradient, the obvious choice was to chain ply, and that's what I did. The skein had been stashed, as I mentioned, so I pulled it out and snapped it a few times to liven it up. I find that skeins become quite compacted when they're stashed for a long time. So next I wound the singles onto a weaving bobbin and placed that bobbin onto a Lazy Kate. From the Lazy Kate, I chain plied the yarn on my Majacraft Susie Pro at roughly 22:1. This is a situation where I don't care particularly about whirls or ratios. I just watched my twist angle to ensure that it didn't get higher than about 40 to 45 degrees. I find chain plied yarns often over ply very quickly because as we are lifting the next loop to create the next yard or so of yarn, we are treadling and the twist is building up quite quickly. Our chain plied yarns often become quite over plied, so just make a note of this and keep it in the back of your mind next time you are chain plying. From there, I immersed the skein into hottish water with some wool wash. I left it to soak for a while, allowing some of the twist to dissipate into the water. I snapped and thwacked the skein and I hung it to dry afterwards. There are so many knitting patterns out there that it is sometimes completely overwhelming. There are many ways to bookmark and save patterns if you are particularly smitten with some, and I encourage you to keep a list of patterns and projects that you hope to make in the coming months and years. I like to use the queue feature on Ravelry, but I recognize that there are some accessibility issues and alternatives are necessary. I have begun to think about using Google Docs to keep my project planning organized, and if there's other resources that you guys have found particularly helpful, please pop those into the comments on the Patreon post or on the YouTube video below. Regardless of what you use, it is a great opportunity to think about how to use your handspun stash more readily. For this project, my main goal was a pattern that would feature and highlight the gradient nature of this yarn. I also wanted a pattern that would be easily modifiable for my gauge, since I knew that I was substituting yarn rather than spinning to match a yarn in the pattern. One of our virtual spin group members suggested the Alaska hat pattern by Camille Descote, a Canadian Montreal-based designer. This is a toque pattern that features a tree line, and it relies on the yarn to create a sky that mimics the northern lights. Something I have noticed myself doing recently is choosing patterns that speak to an event in my life or something precious to me that resonates in the pattern itself. Here, our trip to the north last year resonated and reminded me of the vast twilight that we experienced every evening throughout the month of July. Although we didn't see the northern lights, the sky was incredible, and this skein of yarn reminds me of those evenings. Well, it wasn't really the evening, it was kind of more like 2 a.m. when the kids woke up due to the lightness in the sky, but still, still. My knitting gauge for this yarn worked out to about 18 stitches over 4 inches on 4.5 millimeter or US size 7 needles. The patterns gauge is 7.25 stitches per inch. This is vital information when modifying patterns, and I recommend beginning to modify knitting patterns by starting with something small like a toque or a cowl to learn how to do it. Remember that with a garment, things like grading need to be taken into consideration when you're modifying. So changing the depth or the row gauge can have major ramifications to your garment if it's not taken into consideration. Due to my gauge differences, I was able to calculate the change and cast on an appropriate number of stitches for my size, and I completed 4 pattern repeats rather than what was called for in the pattern. The way to modify stitch counts for cast on is as follows. The cast on stitches called for in the pattern divided by the pattern's knitting gauge over 1 inch. This will give you the number of inches of knitting. Multiply this number by your knitting gauge over 1 inch. That is the number of stitches to cast on using your gauge. Modify this number slightly to ensure you have the correct count for something like 2x2 rib. Casting on an odd number of stitches won't serve you in 2x2 or 1x1 rib, so adding a couple or removing a couple of stitches will not completely ruin your numbers for your item. From there, I calculated how many stitches I needed to increase to ensure I had the appropriate number to start the colorwork charts. If I remember correctly, I only needed to add 4 stitches to help the numbers work out perfectly, and this pattern is a great example of how easy it can be to modify patterns, but slow down, work out your calculations, and double check before you cast on. This will ensure success. Knitting this pattern with this yarn was lovely. It was super fast because of my adaptation of the pattern to worsted weight knitting yarn compared to the fingering originally called for. As I mentioned above, the original pattern was written for fingering weight yarn, so changing to worsted weight meant many fewer stitches. I love patterns like this because they are super interesting. The yarn itself makes or breaks the overall item once it's finished. A yarn with no elasticity or grabbiness doesn't lend itself to color work, for example, because in the finishing, washing, and blocking of the item, the yarns don't have the opportunity to grab onto one another and they almost sort of lock together. In this instance, the Cascade 220 Heathers alongside the Charollais works really well. They are both woolly enough to grab onto one another and create a sturdy, warm, woolly fabric. A win all round. Speaking for a moment about color, this gradient yarn was spun with the intention of leaving the yarn as singles. So for this experiment to go back and chain ply, it meant it affected the overall yardage of the yarn, as well as the distribution of the gradient. In the finished item, the coral sunset color took over the majority of the item, and I was left with only a very small number of rounds at the crown that featured the lovely seafoam blue. At first I was kind of bummed, to be honest. I wanted a smoother transition further down the toque, but after reflecting on the item, washing and finishing it, I am actually quite happy with it. And would you believe that the exact distribution of colors in this background, sky, of the toque greeted me this morning when I woke up outside our bedroom window. Isn't that crazy? Projects like this one give us an opportunity to think outside our spinning comfort zone and approach our yarns with openness and experimentation. We've talked in the past about approaching our projects in the spirit of learning and experimentation, and I repeat that message to you now. We learn by doing, exploring, and wondering. As we engage in all aspects of the process, we can continue to grow and learn. The community here is actively involved in each other's projects, offering feedback and ideas, and I think it's a great way to support one another and to learn from each other in real time. The thing is, there just isn't enough time in the day or the week to make the number of things that the entire community is able to make in a day. By sharing with one another, we are able to take advantage of others' learning. Also, you can live vicariously through one another, which is pretty great. So something we often do in How I Spin and the Thoughtful Spinner, which I will link down below for those interested in learning more about my essay-style PDF downloads that we explore each month, is to explore what I think about once a project is finished and I'm planning things for the future. It is also an opportunity to look back and think about what I might have done knowing what I know now. This is where we grow as hand spinners, controlling all those different aspects of the cloth, from the fiber we choose to the item that we choose to make. For a project like this one, I can see that I lost a lot of yardage by chain plying the singles I'd originally spun. So in some ways, leaving the yarn as singles would have meant that I could knit a larger item like a shawl, or even the original gauge of this particular toque pattern. This would have resulted in a subtle movement of the color from the coral pastel pink to the teal seafoam blue. But instead, I ended up with the majority of the toque in the coral color with a very little bit of the teal at the top, as we talked about. I ended up with a cool pom-pom, but didn't end up with the movement of color as the trees were knit. On the other hand, the chain plied yarn was very pleasant to work with, and the item knit up incredibly fast. So I would probably do this again were I to create this project again. Another thought I had after knitting the toque was the fabric itself. So knowing what I know now and the fit of the toque, I would downsize the needles just once from 4.5 millimeter or US size 7s down to 4 millimeter or US size 6 for the entire toque, not just the ribbing. So the ribbing was knit on 4 millimeter needles, and I would have just knit the whole thing. This would have used a bit more yarn, but the resulting fabric would have been more to my liking. I could have compensated for this extra yarn by working the crown decreases more quickly after the colorwork pattern was complete. This is a small thing to reflect upon, but it will make a lot of difference going forward if I were to make this again. The hand of the finished fabric is important as we grow in our spinning and our making, and these small reflections help us critically reflect and grow as we approach our next project, and our next one, and our next one, and so on. The How I Spin content is also released as a transcript in the form of a downloadable PDF. Please follow the links below to the Patreon post to download this transcript so that you can see what that entails each month. Keeping these PDFs and referring back to them is helpful when you go to plan your own projects. Print them out and create a binder of resources or bookmark them for later reference. Detailed photos are included in the PDFs for you to see what I am working on. Look for the Co-Executive Spinner and the Attentive Spinner tiers on Patreon for all of the How I Spin content, which is released monthly, along with the Thoughtful Spinner, another learning download that is released every month. The following number of months, I'm not sure how many, as the study will unfold somewhat organically and build upon itself, we will be exploring luxury fibers. We will look at blends and silks and camelids and more, and I hope you will think about joining us. If you're interested in learning more about what happens here at Woolen Spinning, please visit patreon.com/WelfordPearls/join. Thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss the weekly podcast episodes when they are released. As well, please don't hesitate to ask questions, reach out, and let me know what you are interested in learning. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video to let others know that you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy spinning, happy knitting, happy dreaming. Bye everyone.